It's strange how certain places never quite leave your memory, even if the work was unremarkable and the days all blurred together. In the summer of 2020, when I was 19, I worked at a juice stand located near the edge of the food court in a mid-sized shopping mall in Tampa, Florida. The pay was average, the hours were inconsistent, and the job itself involved little more than slicing fruit, blending smoothies, and smiling at customers who rarely looked you in the eye. But for someone who had recently graduated and was simply trying to keep busy before committing to anything long-term, it suited me fine at the time. The stand was positioned just far enough from the center of the food court that it often felt slightly removed from the rest of the crowd. Across from it sat a closed-down pretzel shop that no one had leased in months. And beside me was a vacant cell phone kiosk covered in faded promotional stickers for deals that no longer existed. During the first few weeks of that summer, everything followed the routine one would expect. Early morning opening duties, stretches of quiet before the lunch rush, familiar regulars ordering the same drinks, and then the gradual slowdown in the late evening before cleanup. However, sometime around mid-June, I began noticing a man who didn't quite fit the typical mold of the mall's afternoon crowd. He was older than most of the people who frequented the food court during the day, probably in his early to mid-30s. And while he didn't do anything outwardly threatening, there was something about his behavior that immediately struck me as unusual. The first time I noticed him, he bought a bottle of water and lingered nearby, standing at one of the empty food court tables, facing in my general direction, but not appearing to look directly at me, as though he were pretending to be distracted while watching from the edge of his vision. I chalked it up to coincidence, convinced myself he was just waiting for someone, and thought nothing more of it. But then he started showing up again. Not every day, but often enough that I began to recognize the subtle routine he seemed to fall into. He would arrive during the late afternoon, never at the peak of traffic, but just as the energy of the mall started to lull. Sometimes he'd walk by the stand slowly, pretending to glance at the menu, but never ordering anything after that first time. On other occasions, he would sit at the same table across the food court and remain there for extended periods of time without ever taking out a phone, reading anything, or interacting with anyone else. Just sitting silently, occasionally glancing over his shoulder or tilting his head as though pretending to observe something behind me, but always, unmistakably, keeping me in his peripheral view. At first, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. I figured that in a public place like a mall, you were bound to notice familiar faces if you worked there long enough. Maybe he was just one of those eccentric types who spent time people-watching. But eventually, the pattern became too clear to ignore, and I couldn't help but feel a growing discomfort every time I saw him enter the food court. There was no emotion in his expression when our eyes would meet. He didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't shift his gaze in embarrassment the way most people might when caught staring. Instead, his face would remain completely still, his body relaxed in a way that didn't seem casual so much as deliberately passive, as though he wanted to be seen without giving anything away. One particular evening, near closing, I stayed a bit later than usual to help clean up a spill that had been left behind by a customer. The food court was mostly empty by then, and most of the other vendors had already begun locking up. As I was finishing up, I caught sight of him again, standing just beyond the main walkway near the hallway that led to the staff corridors and mall offices. It was strange to see him lingering so close to an employee-only area, especially since he didn't appear to be leaving the mall or heading toward the exit. He wasn't looking at me anymore. In fact, his gaze was directed down the corridor, almost like he was waiting for someone or listening for something. I remember the way the overhead lights flickered briefly above him, as if the aging fixtures couldn't quite decide whether to stay on or not. And for some reason, that detail made the moment feel even more unsettling. When I finally left the stand, I decided to take the back hallway route to the staff room so I could clock out and avoid passing him. The staff corridor was dimmer than usual that night. Most of the overhead lights already switched off for closing, and the air felt unusually thick and stale, like the kind of humidity you feel in an old storage room. As I turned the corner to approach the side exit, I felt a presence before I even heard the sound. A faint shuffle, the kind of quiet movement that makes your skin crawl. Not because it's loud, but because it shouldn't be there at all. When I looked up, I saw him again, standing near the locked door that led to the electrical access room. A place no customer should have been able to reach without a keycard or employee escort. He wasn't moving toward me. He wasn't speaking. He was just standing there, facing me directly in the narrow hallway, his face still wearing that same unreadable expression I'd come to dread over the last few weeks. For several long seconds, neither of us said or did anything. I felt frozen in place, like I had stepped into a dream where time stretches impossibly thin, and every heartbeat seems louder than the silence surrounding it. The only thing that broke me out of that paralysis was the sudden realization that no one else was near enough to hear me if I called out. My manager had already left, and most of the mall's cleaning crew wouldn't pass through that section for at least another 15 minutes. I turned and walked quickly back the way I came, not daring to look over my shoulder until I reached the double doors that led to the main concourse. By the time I got to the front and reported the incident to mall security, they offered a vague apology, saying someone would check the cameras, only to follow up the next day explaining that there had been a malfunction with the surveillance system covering that particular hallway. They assured me they'd keep an eye out, but it was clear from the tone in their voices that they didn't view the situation with the same level of seriousness I did. The next day, I handed in my notice without much fanfare. I told them I had found another opportunity elsewhere, though the truth was, I simply couldn't stomach the idea of walking through those back corridors again, wondering whether I might find him waiting for me in silence. I've worked other jobs since then, some in busier places, some in quieter ones. But I've never forgotten the eerie stillness of that hallway, or the way it felt to be watched not out of curiosity or even malice, but with a kind of cold, patient intent that I still can't fully explain. And to this day, whenever I find myself in a shopping mall, especially late in the evening when the crowds have thinned and the stores begin to shutter, I find myself looking, not because I expect to see him again, but because some small, irrational part of me still believes he never really left. By the time I had grown accustomed to the evening shifts at the department store where I worked, particularly during the colder months when the temperatures in Des Moines began to plummet with unsettling consistency, I had also become attuned to the peculiar silence that settled over the mall each night as it emptied of both customers and light, leaving behind only the vague hum of dying fluorescent fixtures and the distant echo of automated announcements looping pointlessly over the PA system. The mall itself was a suburban structure on the outskirts of the city, once a thriving retail hub, now slowly deteriorating into irrelevance, where the vacancy of shuttered storefronts seemed to expand each year, and where the overwhelming sense of economic decay had infused every hallway with a quiet, uncomfortable stillness that never quite lifted, even during peak hours. The department store where I worked occupied a corner of that increasingly hollow structure, and although it still maintained the appearance of being operational, those of us who worked there understood that its days were numbered, and that the store functioned less as a retail space and more as a holding zone for merchandise nobody really wanted, and employees who had grown used to the smell of stale air and dust-coated mannequins. It was during one of these routine closing shifts, sometime in early November of 2021, that I experienced something that would remain with me long after I left that job. And perhaps long after I had convinced myself that it was best not to think about it too deeply. That particular evening had started unremarkably enough, with the usual trickle of late customers shuffling through clearance racks and asking about expired coupons, followed by the predictable exodus of floor staff as various departments began shutting down operations shortly before 9 o'clock. The store closed promptly at 9 p.m., and by 9:15 the only remaining employees were myself and a small skeleton crew consisting of a floor lead, a backroom associate, and a cashier finishing their closing till reconciliation, each of us scattered in separate zones of the building and focused on our respective end-of-day responsibilities. My own task was to complete a simple inventory check on a set of returns before heading back to the employee break room, where I would retrieve my belongings and clock out for the night using the aging biometric terminal mounted beside the lockers. The hallway that led to the break room was not accessible to the general public and had always struck me as oddly clinical in contrast to the artificial warmth of the sales floor. A narrow, L-shaped corridor painted in a dull institutional white, lit by flickering ceiling fixtures that buzzed faintly no matter how many times the maintenance team claimed to have replaced the ballasts. At the end of this hallway stood a large gray steel security door, unmistakably industrial in design, which had been fitted with a digital badge access panel positioned just to the right of the frame and reinforced with a magnetic lock that engaged automatically upon closure. The door had no exterior handle and could only be opened from the outside by scanning an authorized employee ID. From the inside, it could be pushed open using a crash bar. But regardless of the direction, the lock was supposed to engage the moment it closed, leaving no possibility for it to remain ajar unintentionally. It was the kind of door you simply trusted to stay shut. A silent barrier separating the public-facing parts of the building from the behind-the-scenes maze of storage cages, staff restrooms, utility access points, and lockers, none of which were ever intended to be accessed after hours by anyone but employees with clearance. As I approached the corridor that night, weary from a long shift and thinking of little more than getting home to a hot shower and a few hours of peace, I rounded the corner expecting to find everything exactly as I had left it earlier that day. The hallway empty, the security door firmly shut, and the badge panel blinking its usual steady red. What I saw instead was something that made me stop short mid-step, the breath catching ever so slightly in my throat. Not from fear, not yet, but from the immediate dissonance of something that simply should not have been. The door, which had always remained firmly locked unless actively accessed, was standing slightly open, no more than 2 or 3 inches, but enough that a narrow, vertical seam of pitch-black darkness was now visible between the edge of the door and the frame. A darkness that didn't look like shadow, but instead resembled the absence of any light at all, as if the space beyond the door had somehow been carved out of the world rather than merely unlit. For a long moment, I simply stared at it, my body motionless while my mind scrambled to assemble a rational explanation. Perhaps someone had just exited and forgotten to let it shut fully, or maybe maintenance had been in and failed to close it properly, but no matter how I tried to frame it, the facts didn't align. There were no footsteps, no distant sounds of movement, no trace of anyone who might have opened the door and walked through. The hallway was empty. The silence that surrounded me felt dense and unnatural. as if the very air had thickened in anticipation of something yet to occur. I stepped forward cautiously, each movement deliberate and slow. When I reached the door, I extended a hand, not to push it open, but merely to steady myself against its cold, steel surface, which felt far colder than the surrounding air should have allowed. I expected it to swing inward easily, responding to my touch with the weightless compliance of a poorly secured door. But instead it resisted, just slightly but unmistakably, as though something on the other side was holding it in place, applying a subtle counterpressure that made me pull my hand away and step back once more. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just my own imagination layering meaning onto silence, but the sound repeated, faint, intermittent, and unsettlingly organic. A low, dragging noise, like the slow shuffle of fabric or something soft being pulled across a rough surface without any apparent urgency or rhythm. It wasn't metallic, and it wasn't mechanical. It was uneven, almost as though whatever was moving lacked coordination or was deliberately trying not to be heard. I strained to listen, my body rooted to the spot by a mixture of unease and involuntary curiosity. But the sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun, replaced once again by the oppressive silence that now seemed to pulse faintly around me, like a low hum, just beneath the threshold of hearing. Without making any sound, I slowly began to step backward, unwilling to take my eyes off the door. And as I did, I watched, unblinking and entirely still, as the door began to swing inward on its own. It didn't slam or creak or behave in any way that might suggest faulty hydraulics or a draft. Rather, it moved with an eerie smoothness, the way a person might ease a door shut when trying not to draw attention. And with each inch that it retreated, the strip of darkness behind it seemed to grow heavier, more palpable, as though it were reaching out into the hallway. Then, just as gradually as it had opened, the door began to close again. Not quickly, and not with any mechanical recoil, but with a deliberate steadiness that felt guided by something unseen. When it finally shut, sealing the corridor once more, a soft click of the magnetic lock re-engaging was almost too quiet to register, but I felt it more than I heard it. A final, inevitable punctuation to something I didn't understand. I remained frozen for several seconds longer, unable to will my legs to move, even as my mind urged me to walk away. Each beat of my heart echoing in my ears like a dull drum. The chill that had seeped into my chest intensifying into something sharp and heavy, as if the air around me had turned dense enough to press against my ribs. Eventually, I forced myself to turn around, not with the frantic urgency that instinct might have demanded, but in a stiff, automatic manner, like someone moving through a fog of confusion and disbelief, and began walking in the opposite direction, deliberately choosing the longer, less convenient path that looped around the store's interior rather than take even a single step past that slightly open security door. When I reached the front of the store, where the lights were brighter and the background music still played on low volume over the PA system, I made my way to the register area, where one of the assistant supervisors stood hunched over the counter, tapping figures into a closing spreadsheet with the flat exhaustion that accompanied every late shift, trying to sound casual, like someone making idle conversation rather than someone quietly unraveling. I asked if anyone had been working near the break room or the employee hallway in the last hour, phrasing it like a logistical question tied to store operations, rather than something born of concern or fear. She barely looked up, simply shook her head, and told me, without hesitation, that no one had business in that part of the building tonight. and that all the evening shift employees with clearance to use the restricted hallway had already clocked out and left at least 20 minutes ago through the main entrance. I must have paused just long enough to draw attention to my uncertainty or discomfort, because she added something else. A comment she delivered with a kind of rehearsed nonchalance that didn't quite mask the discomfort behind her words. She said that she had heard of other employees mentioning strange incidents in that same area over the years, particularly involving the exact same security door occasionally being discovered ajar after hours, despite the badge system showing no authorized access attempts. There had also been rumors, she emphasized that word, rumors, about sounds being heard from inside the locked corridor, noises that didn't match the building's usual mechanical creaks or HVAC activity. According to her, the surveillance camera that should have been monitoring that portion of the hallway had been malfunctioning for some time, plagued by what was vaguely described as a recurring electrical fault that apparently no one in management had ever made a serious effort to fix, despite multiple service requests being submitted. There had never been an official inquiry, no internal memos, no incident documentation, just a general acknowledgement from higher-ups that the system was glitchy, followed by the kind of offhand warnings that people gave when they didn't want to be asked too many questions. Phrases like, "just weird night shift stuff," or "probably nothing to worry about," or "you get used to it eventually." But I didn't want to get used to it. And I knew, somewhere deep down, that what I had seen or felt or almost encountered back there wasn't something you just dismissed as a trick of the light or a bad fuse. I didn't say anything else. I simply clocked out, quietly collected my things, and walked out through the front vestibule without making eye contact with anyone. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and the blast of cold night air hit my face as I stepped into the vacant parking lot, the overhead lamps above casting a flickering yellow glow that only seemed to deepen the surrounding darkness instead of dispelling it. The lot was silent, windless, almost frozen in stillness. And yet I found myself hurrying to my car with the same internal urgency as someone being watched. The kind of instinctive discomfort that defied rational explanation. Though I never mentioned the incident again, not to my coworkers, not to my friends, and certainly not to my supervisors, I returned to work the following week as though nothing had happened, maintaining the same polite routines and fulfilling my responsibilities without question. But I made a quiet decision that night, one I never reversed. I would never again pass through that hallway, no matter how much time it cost me or how inefficient it made my route through the store. I found alternate ways to reach the break room, alternate doors to access the stockroom, even if it meant walking in circles or making unnecessary detours. And although some coworkers occasionally glanced at me with mild confusion, I know no one ever asked why I avoided that section. Perhaps they already knew. Or perhaps they'd had their own reasons for avoiding it too. Years have gone by since then, and I've long since left that job behind, moved on to other cities and other roles, but I still remember every detail of that night with disturbing clarity. The bitter cold of the door handle as I touched it, the unnatural silence that followed that slow dragging sound, and the faint movement of that heavy steel door as it began to ease shut on its own, smooth and deliberate, with no visible force behind it. And though I never dared to push it open again, and never allowed myself to look too long into that darkened space beyond it, there are moments, quiet, lonely moments, when I still find myself wondering what would have happened if I had stepped inside. If I had ignored every instinct that told me to turn away and instead walked forward into whatever waited behind that unmarked corridor and that door that should never have opened. It was the winter of 2018 when something happened during one of my evening shifts that would later linger in my mind far longer than I had ever anticipated, carving itself into the quiet spaces of my memory in a way that only truly strange and disquieting experiences can. I had been working at a clothing store located in a rather forgettable retail plaza on Long Island. The kind of place people only stopped at on their way to somewhere else, with faded signage, dim lighting in the parking lot, and a dull row of neighboring businesses that all looked like they had stopped trying years ago. The store itself sold moderately priced clothes that rotated by season, and while there was always something to tidy or refold, the job didn't demand much in the way of imagination or energy. Most nights passed in a routine haze of music looping on through the same playlists and the smell of synthetic fabric mixed with stale heating. Corporate had recently made the decision to limit evening shifts to just one person on duty, a cost-cutting measure that had stirred some grumbling among the staff but hadn't prompted any real pushback, partly because most of us were just there to make rent, and partly because, up until that point, there had never been any reason to feel unsafe in the store. I had done solo closing shifts before and had come to appreciate the solitude, even if the long, echoing silence after dark sometimes made the building feel a little too empty for comfort. There was something oddly peaceful about walking through those aisles alone, with the buzz of fluorescent lights above and the soft whir of the ventilation system filtering through the ceiling vents. That particular night, I had locked the front entrance promptly at closing time, flipped the sign to closed, and was making my way through the last of the routine tasks, folding returns, clearing out the dressing rooms, and preparing the registers for final count, when I realized I needed to restock a couple of returned items in the inventory room. The hallway leading to the back of the store was narrow and painted in that institutional shade of gray beige that seems designed specifically to be forgotten. And it ended in a thick metal door that separated the main store from the stockroom where all our boxed merchandise was stored. That door was not only heavy, but equipped with an automatic locking system that either required a key or a 4-digit access code entered on a keypad nearby. A security feature put in place after an incident at a sister location involving internal theft. As I approached the end of the hallway, I stopped in my tracks because the inventory room door was not only unlocked, but slightly ajar, left open just enough to activate the motion-sensitive light inside, which now cast a pale glow into the corridor, spilling across the floor and catching the edge of my shoes. At first, I simply stared at it, trying to reconstruct the events of my shift, searching my memory for whether I had entered the room earlier and possibly forgotten to shut it properly. But I knew I hadn't gone near the stockroom that evening. My keys had been clipped to my waistband the entire shift, and I had made no trips to the back since arriving. There was something about the way the door stood open, not wide, not swung back carelessly, but just enough to remain unnoticed at a glance, that sent a slow, cold wave of unease through my chest. Not a sudden jolt of fear, but a crawling awareness that something was off in a way I couldn't immediately explain. After several seconds of hesitation, I stepped forward and pushed the door open more fully, feeling the smooth resistance of its weight as it creaked slightly against the hinges, revealing the rows of metal shelving inside, stacked with cardboard boxes labeled by category: outerwear, clearance, spring arrivals, all organized with the usual bland efficiency. The air inside the stockroom felt slightly stale, but more than that, it carried that subtle heaviness that a room sometimes takes on when it's been recently occupied by someone who isn't supposed to be there. A kind of lingering presence you can't quite point to, but which your body seems to notice before your mind can process it. I walked slowly between the aisles, not immediately seeing anything out of place, but still feeling that strange pull of instinct that told me I wasn't entirely alone in that room, even if no one else was visible. It wasn't until I rounded the far corner, where the shelving units backed up against the farthest wall, that I saw something that stopped me completely and forced the breath from my lungs in a slow, measured exhale that I hadn't realized I was holding. Tucked behind one of the taller racks, the kind we rarely touched outside of seasonal turnover, was what could only be described as a makeshift sleeping area. Someone had laid out a flattened cardboard box to serve as a kind of crude mattress, and atop it was a worn-out sleeping bag, dark in color and creased along the edges, where it had clearly been folded and refolded multiple times. Surrounding the makeshift bed were scattered remnants of someone's quiet, hidden existence. Empty fast food wrappers crumpled and tucked behind the boxes, the foil from granola bars, a small plastic spoon that still had a faint smear of dried soup or sauce on it, and an empty paper coffee cup bearing the familiar logo of a nearby gas station that I passed each morning on my way to work. It was not just the presence of these objects that disturbed me, but the methodical way in which they had been arranged, concealed from casual view, carefully tucked out of sight, hidden in a part of the room that saw little traffic from employees. This had not been the work of someone who had stumbled in by accident or taken brief refuge out of desperation. This was a deliberate hiding place, used repeatedly and, it maintained just well enough to remain undiscovered. The realization that someone had been living in the store, hidden in the very room we assumed was always secure, settled into me slowly at first. Not with the sharpness of sudden fear, but with the numbing heaviness of dawning comprehension. And then, as my mind caught up with my eyes, another thought arrived. If this person had been sleeping here at night, then there was a chance, however small, that they were still here now. I took a single step backward, my eyes scanning the far edges of the room, my ears straining for even the slightest movement. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anyone. But I could not shake the feeling that the room was still holding something, or someone, just beyond my vision. Without a word, and without bothering to finish the rest of my tasks, I turned and walked out of the stockroom, pulling the door shut behind me and locking it with fingers that felt unsteady against the key. I didn't stop to check the break room or the restroom down the hall. I didn't return to the register to finish closing procedures or fill out the end-of-shift forms. Instead, I collected my coat and bag and exited the store through the front entrance, breaking protocol, which dictated that all employees were to leave through the staff exit in the back. Because I could not bring myself to walk past that open corridor one more time. The following morning, I showed up earlier than usual, still running on the same nerves I'd left with the night before, and brought the matter to my manager's attention. I had taken a quick photo with my phone. Nothing clear or artistic, just a grainy snapshot of the sleeping bag and scattered trash that I managed to snap right before backing out of the room. At first, he looked skeptical, probably thinking I was making a big deal out of some old donation left behind or a forgotten shipment. But when I showed him the photo, something in his face shifted. He didn't say much, just nodded, told me to wait while he made a call, and from there, it moved fast. By midday, someone from regional management had already reached out, and the loss prevention team was pulling security footage from the back hallway. The store's camera system wasn't comprehensive. The main floor and the cash wrap were covered, but the inventory room had never had a camera installed, probably because no one thought it needed one. Still, there was a camera angled over the employee entrance near the loading dock. That footage showed something I think we all wished we hadn't seen. On 2 separate nights, around 2:20 in the morning, a figure appeared on the screen. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, with a hood pulled up and his face turned away from the camera the entire time. What struck everyone, even the district manager who had come in to watch the footage with us, was how comfortable the man seemed. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He walked directly to the employee door, pulled something from his pocket, maybe a copied key card or some kind of homemade tool, and let himself in without resistance. He moved down the hallway toward the stockroom, and then the camera lost him. That was it. No footage of him leaving. No sign of panic, no vandalism, no theft. He had come in quietly, used the space like it belonged to him, and vanished without disturbing a single item of merchandise. We watched the clip in silence. Someone eventually said, "Well, at least nothing was stolen." And someone else mentioned the possibility of homelessness or squatting. But none of us knew what to make of the calm, deliberate way the man had moved through a secured area like it was just another stop on his nightly routine. The police were called and a report was filed, but since there were no damages, no break-in marks, and no confirmed criminal activity, there wasn't much they could do. The footage wasn't clear enough to get an ID. They called it trespassing and left it at that. Management responded by having the locks changed throughout the building. We got new door codes. Employees were reminded several times to keep secure areas closed at all times and to report anything unusual. From a corporate standpoint, the incident was addressed and resolved. But the resolution never really reached me. Even after the locks were changed and procedures tightened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd missed something, that we had found the end of one trail, but not the person who had left it. I started moving differently through the building. I took quicker steps down the back hallway, kept the inventory door in my line of sight when I was nearby, and found myself straining to hear sounds I wasn't even sure I had heard. Every time I was alone in the building, I caught myself glancing up at corners, checking behind racks, wondering if someone might still be back there, tucked just out of view like before. A few weeks later, I decided I was done. I didn't make a scene, didn't tell anyone the real reason. I just said I'd found something else with better hours and turned in my notice. They asked if it had anything to do with that earlier incident, and I shrugged and told them no. But the truth was, it had everything to do with it. It wasn't fear of what had happened. It was the realization of how easy it had been for it to happen without anyone noticing. I moved on, found another job, a different store, different layout, different locks. But now and then, not often, just when the conditions are right. I'll remember that sleeping bag, flattened into the cardboard, pressed into the corner like someone had been curling up there for nights. I think about how close he had been, how long he might have stayed hidden, and how none of us noticed. I don't think he meant harm, but I also don't think he cared how long we stayed unaware. And that somehow is worse. It was in the late weeks of 2019, during that quiet lull before the holidays begin to stir up the malls with noise and color, when I found myself wandering through a shopping center in Spokane, Washington. Having left work early under the pretense of catching up on errands I had put off for too long. Though in truth, I think I simply wanted an excuse to escape the dull office air. and the slowly encroaching grayness of that particular November afternoon. The mall wasn't busy, which didn't surprise me, since it was midweek and approaching dusk, the kind of hour when the daylight fades just slowly enough to make you forget when it left entirely. And the artificial lighting inside the building seemed harsher by comparison, flickering faintly above the rows of storefronts, like a performance of normalcy no one fully believed in anymore. I stepped into one of the larger retail chains, one of those department-style clothing stores that always smell faintly of polyester and floor wax, their wide aisles stretching endlessly under mirrored walls, filled with neutral tones and sales signs that had begun to feel more like decoration than actual invitations. I wasn't searching for anything in particular, though I remembered a winter coat I had passed up the week before, and I thought I might find it again if it hadn't been sold or moved. As I made my way toward the back of the store, weaving quietly between mannequins and half-stocked racks, I began to notice something that didn't quite belong. At first, a subtle shift in atmosphere, something almost imperceptible, like the way the air changes before a storm, though there were no windows nearby and no reason for the change. Then I heard it. The sound was faint enough that I almost mistook it for part of the music playing overhead, one of those bland instrumental tracks that always seem designed to fade into the background. But this didn't follow any rhythm or melody. And as I paused to listen more closely, I realized what I was hearing was not music at all, but a voice, a child's voice. It came again, clearer this time, and although I don't remember the exact tone or volume, I remember the unmistakable quality of the words themselves. Help me. Spoken with just enough clarity to cut through the store's low ambient hum and lodge somewhere deep in my chest before I could even process what I had heard. Instinctively, I turned toward the source, which seemed to come from the hallway that led to the store's dressing rooms tucked away at the very back, past the winter accessories and end-of-season racks. And as I approached, I noticed how the atmosphere shifted even further, the lighting growing subtly dimmer and the air unnaturally still, as though the space itself was holding its breath. The corridor was narrow and silent, the overhead lights buzzing faintly, casting a dull yellowish glow along the row of closed changing room doors. And as I walked slowly down the hall, I felt a pressure in my ears, the kind you get when descending quickly in an airplane or entering deep water. Though there was no change in elevation, and certainly no reason for the growing sensation of weight behind my eyes. At the very end of the row, my eyes were drawn downward, and it was there, beneath the last door on the left, that I saw them. Two small bare feet, still and pale under the harsh light, with toes slightly curled inward in a posture that struck me not only as fragile, but as inexplicably resigned, like the posture of a child who has been standing in silence for far too long. I remember most clearly that there was a red Band-Aid, slightly askew, wrapped just above the left ankle, an oddly specific detail that would later seem all the more impossible to have imagined. Its bright color standing in eerie contrast to the almost bluish pallor of the skin around it. I didn't knock, and I didn't speak. I simply stared, frozen for a moment in some half-thought sense of disbelief, as though the stall door itself were suspended in time, and whatever was behind it was waiting for someone, maybe me, to act. Eventually, I turned back down the hallway and walked quickly to the front of the store, where I found a sales associate folding sweaters with the same expressionless rhythm you see in people who have learned to operate their bodies without fully occupying them. And when I told her what I had seen, describing the voice I had heard and the small figure behind the door, her demeanor changed, not with panic, but with a kind of professional unease that comes from knowing you can't afford to dismiss a report like that, even if it sounds strange. She followed me back to the fitting room corridor, and I remember that she didn't speak as we walked, didn't ask me to repeat what I'd seen, and didn't seem eager to dismiss it as a prank or misunderstanding, which only added to the growing sense that something about the place was wrong in a way none of us could quite say aloud. When we reached the stall at the end of the row, she knocked gently, waited, and then called out, her voice low but firm, the way someone speaks to a frightened child. There was no answer. The feet were no longer visible. She hesitated for only a second before using her key to unlock the door. The stall was completely empty. The small wooden bench inside looked untouched, the mirror on the wall unmarked by fingerprints, the tile floor bare and clean. There were no signs of movement, no discarded clothes or forgotten shopping bags, and nothing to indicate if anyone had stood inside that space just moments before, much less a child with bare feet and a red band-aid on her ankle. I stood there in silence while she looked at me, not with disbelief exactly, but with a cautious sympathy, the kind of look reserved for people who have just described something that doesn't quite fit into any explainable category. She called over a colleague, and after a brief exchange that I didn't fully register, they pulled up the fitting room access log, which apparently tracked each customer who had been let in during the past hour. And according to the records, only 2 adults had been signed in earlier that afternoon, both of whom had already left, leaving me as the only person currently using the area. Still visibly unsettled, I asked the associate if the store had any security cameras covering the hallway leading to the dressing rooms. She explained, with a kind of calm professionalism that suggested she'd answered similar questions before, that while there were no cameras inside the fitting rooms themselves due to legal privacy constraints, the hallway that led into them was covered by a motion-triggered camera near the ceiling. She radioed someone from mall security, and a few minutes later, I found myself in their small, windowless office tucked behind a hallway most shoppers probably never noticed. A grainy monitor glowed in the corner as one of the guards queued up the footage from earlier that afternoon. They rewound to the time I estimated I had heard the voice. The screen showed me walking toward the fitting rooms, alone. The camera had a clear view of the corridor entrance. We watched the footage again. No one had entered ahead of me. No one followed behind. No child. No shadow. No movement other than mine. The timestamp matched. I had been the only person to walk into that hallway for at least 40 minutes before and after the time of the incident. I remember staring at the screen, almost waiting for it to glitch or reveal something we'd missed. A flicker of motion, a figure slipping past the corner of the frame, anything. But there was nothing. Just me. Mall security did a quick check through recent incident reports, just to be thorough. There were no reports of a lost child in the building that day. No parent had come forward. No 911 calls. No internal alerts. When I described the feet, the size, the paleness, the red band-aid, there was nothing on file that matched. Nothing to suggest anyone had seen anything even remotely similar. Eventually, one of the guards leaned back in his chair and offered a polite, slightly uneasy shrug, the kind people use when they've run out of procedures. It wasn't rude, it wasn't dismissive, but it was clear that from their point of view, the matter had no clear next step. I wasn't asked to fill out a formal report. The staff didn't follow up. There was no internal memo circulated. It was as though the whole thing was quietly folded away, acknowledged just enough to be polite, but not enough to be taken seriously. I left the mall that evening with the same shopping bag I'd come in with, empty. I never told many people about what happened. A few friends, one coworker once when we were talking about strange experiences. But even then, I didn't give the full version. I just said I'd heard something strange, something I couldn't explain. I've gone back to that mall a few times since then, usually when I have no other choice. I'll walk past that store, glance toward the dressing room corridor as I pass, but I've never gone back inside. Not because I'm afraid of what I might see, but because I'm afraid I won't. Because if I go back, and the hallway is just a hallway, and the stalls are empty, and the silence is absolute, then maybe I'll have to admit that I really was alone that day. That I heard something that wasn't there. That I saw something no one else could verify. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know what I heard. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even loud. Just a small, tired voice asking for help. Not panicked, not pleading, just waiting. And I can still hear it sometimes, even now, when the house is quiet and the night is long, and I haven't thought about that place in weeks. Help me. 2 simple words, said like they'd been said before, like they'd been echoing in that hallway for a long time. And after that, nothing. No more footsteps, no explanation, just silence. Like whoever it was, whatever it was, had always been meant to go unnoticed. It was late in the evening, just a few minutes before closing, and the store had begun to sink into that familiar end-of-day quiet. The kind that settles in once the last round of customers finishes browsing and employees begin turning their attention toward cleaning up, shutting down registers, and mentally preparing to leave. I was restocking a shelf near the front of the store, moving slowly but methodically as the background music, barely audible through the store's overhead speakers, played something forgettable that no one was really listening to. A few stragglers remained inside, wandering without urgency, their conversations soft and inconsequential, giving no hint that anything unusual was about to happen. Without any preamble or sign that something was wrong, the fire alarm suddenly burst into life with an ear-splitting shriek that jolted everyone in the store into a stunned pause. The high-pitched siren accompanied by harsh, rapid flashes of the strobe lights mounted on the ceiling. For a few seconds, I stood frozen, instinctively looking up and around, expecting to see smoke or at least some kind of disruption that would have justified such a sudden and aggressive alert. But there was nothing. Only the sterile hum of the lights and the confused expressions of customers who were now beginning to murmur uncertainly among themselves, glancing around as if someone else might have an explanation that would calm their nerves. Though the alarm was overwhelming in its intensity, there was an eerie lack of urgency in those first few moments. No visible signs of fire, no smell of burning materials, no shouts or rapid movement. Just the blaring sound filling the air, and the realization that something had gone wrong, but without any obvious cause. The assistant manager at the time quickly moved toward the front, waving people toward the exit and raising his voice above the alarm to direct both employees and customers to evacuate. While I followed behind, repeating the same instructions and watching as people began to move more quickly, their faces reflecting a mixture of irritation and anxiety. As we emerged from the store and into the wide corridor of the mall, the sound of the alarm echoed across the tiled floors and glass storefronts, amplifying the disorientation. While clusters of employees and shoppers from other nearby stores began to gather, some asking questions, others merely standing around in silence, trying to understand what was happening. It didn't take long before uniformed security personnel started moving through the area, encouraging people to clear the space and directing them toward designated exits. Their faces calm but focused, as though they had handled these situations before and were trained to act without showing uncertainty. Only a few minutes had passed before fire department vehicles pulled up outside, their lights casting long flashes of red and blue across the concrete of the loading area. And within moments, firefighters entered the building in full gear, moving with precision as they disappeared into the mall's interior without engaging much with the growing crowd that had now formed outside. We waited as the minutes stretched longer, and while no one was panicking, there was a growing sense of unease. Not because we feared there was a real fire, but because of the strange silence that accompanied the situation once we were all outside, standing in the unusually cool night air with no clear sense of what had caused the evacuation in the first place. Eventually, after what felt like an unreasonably long time, one of the mall administrators returned to speak with a few of the managers and informed them, quietly and without offering much detail, that there had been no fire, no gas leak, and no technical malfunction in the alarm system. The activation, we were told, had been traced to a fire panel in a secured service corridor, an area that wasn't just inaccessible to the public, but required credentialed keycard access, typically reserved for facility staff, maintenance contractors, or other authorized personnel working behind the scenes. In the hours that followed, while employees were ushered home and storefront gates were pulled down earlier than usual, internal reports began quietly circulating among mall management and corporate loss prevention teams. It didn't take long before a snippet of security footage from a service corridor surfaced, showing a lone figure stepping out of a secured maintenance hallway just moments before the fire alarm was pulled. The person wore dark, oversized clothing, their face hidden beneath a low hood and mask, and their hands gloved. What stood out most wasn't what they did, but how they did it. There was no panic, no hesitation, no scanning of surroundings like someone worried about getting caught. The way he moved, unhurried, almost bored, suggested a level of comfort with a space that didn't sit right. No signs of forced entry were found near the maintenance hallway. The fire panel hadn't been tampered with, and nothing in the logs showed any official keycard access that would have allowed someone through that particular door at that time. That was what really started to spook people. Not that someone pulled the alarm, but that whoever did it probably didn't break in. They got in another way. Someone may have let them in, or maybe they'd cloned access credentials, or maybe there was a flaw in the infrastructure that no one had noticed until now. Whatever it was clear this wasn't random. Naturally, the rumor mill kicked into high gear. Some employees were convinced it had to be an ex-worker, someone angry enough to want revenge but smart enough to avoid getting caught. Others thought it was a setup. Someone testing response times, seeing how fast the building could be cleared, how long it would take first responders to arrive, what the camera coverage looked like during the chaos. The scariest part wasn't what happened that night. It was that nothing else did. No robbery, no distraction for a theft across the mall, no sign that anything was taken or planned. Just the alarm, a clean exit, and silence. In the weeks that followed, mall operations quietly tightened. Staff were retrained on emergency protocols. Security added more cameras in the service corridors and rewired access panels for better tracking. Employees were told to badge in more consistently, and maintenance schedules were reorganized to avoid unsupervised access to restricted areas. But even with all that, the sense of unease never fully went away. I still think about it sometimes. How easy it was for someone to walk into a space they didn't belong, do something that shut down a whole section of the mall, and walk right back out without leaving a single clue behind. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt deliberate, planned. And the fact that we never got a name or a reason, that's the part that sticks with you. Because in the end, the scariest thing wasn't that we were targeted. It's realizing how thin the line is between what we assume is safe and what someone with the right knowledge can walk right through. No damage, no trace, just a reminder that someone was there, and we still don't know why.